Okay. So first of all, welcome to everyone. So this is the last internal seminar of the Statistics and Probability Seminar Series at the University of Nottingham. This is the last one for this academic year. Next year we will have other internal seminars. In particular, we have already two speakers, which are Richard Wilkinson and Christy Bolton. So today's speaker is Karthik Bharath. Karthik is an important member of our group. He's currently an associate professor. Karthik research interests are in geometric statistics, functional and shape data analysis, stochastic processes, and quantum information. Karthik, correct me if I forgot something. No, good.
No.
So Karthik has also some important role in the Royal Statistical Society. First of all, he's a member of the research section, and is an associate editor of the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, Series B. So Karthik, I want to thank you for talking in our internal series of seminars. As you know, these seminars are available outside the University of Nottingham. And today, Karthik will talk about shape space and models for functional data. So before I start, I advise everyone to mute the microphone. Karthik, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabrizio. Thanks for the kind words and the invitation. Right. So as the title suggests, I'll be speaking a bit on the shape space of functions, basically, and their use as models or modeling spaces for functional data. This is ongoing joint work with Ian German at Durham. This has been going on for a while, and it's some interesting work. Hopefully you will all find it equally interesting as well. As the title suggests, there are two main strands to this talk. One is what we mean by a shape of a function. What does it mean? Intuitively, we all understand what it means. At least we think we do. So we can formalize that and then look at the geometry of the space of such shapes in some sense. And the second half of the talk will look at how we can use this notion of shape while analyzing functional data. Why is this notion of shape a relevant quantity of interest, for instance? How can we define statistical models on these shapes? Once, if I do convince you that it is relevant. In fact, one can make a case saying the order should be reversed also, saying I start with the functional data and then I go on to the geometrical considerations. That's a valid argument as such as well. A disclaimer right at the beginning, I posed these questions. I have partial answers to a few of them, Ian and I. In fact, I'll end up posing more questions. It's one of the reasons why this is still ongoing, because we've been going through it fairly slowly because there are some intricate questions. Right, so the first part is I'll define what the shape of a function is and then make some comments on the space. So let's take a function which is just real valued from the unit interval. And mathematically, if we think of a shape of a function, we think of properties such as monotonicity, convexity, concavity, or unimodality, right? So you can think of functions which either go like this, or which are either unimodal, or which are bimodal. Immediately we think of these kind of notions of shape. Or more intuitively to the layperson, you might think of shape as those changes which occur mainly along the y direction, either in the forms of how many times the derivative of the function changes, or the number of times it crosses zero, how different are the heights of the valleys and the peaks and so on. These are very intuitive definitions of shape, and they are all correct in a certain sense. And what I'm going to try and do is to match this intuition to some kind of formalism and then see where that takes us effectively. But I want to first say that this notion or this kind of an intuitive understanding of shape has been used before in the scientific endeavor. I even found something back in 1868, something very appropriate today, by Arthur Ransom, who in fact starts the article appropriately by saying there is probably no more legitimate use of the instrument of statistics than its application to the study of epidemic disease. He seems almost like a soothsayer, but this was in almost 150 years ago. And then there are three epidemic curves here based on weekly readings. The first row corresponds to measles. The second is bronchitis and whooping cough. Okay, weekly readings of number of cases in Manchester. And he starts off by saying each disease, when it becomes an epidemic, has a remarkably regular, almost symmetrical arrangement in its ups and downs, okay, which is roughly what we think of when we think of a shape. And if you look at the first two, I will just, if it's not very clear, I can just quickly just draw over this. Roughly, if I sort of interpolate over these things, this might be the curve for measles. And then I have a rough one for bronchitis. He makes the statement here saying the disease curves display another curious phenomenon. There's apparent hostility of one epidemic to the other, meaning when one is peaking, the other one is not peaking, right? So he mainly refers to these two when he's talking about, he mainly refers to measles and bronchitis. On the other hand, whooping cough, you could justifiably say it has a different shape. Maybe it has fewer number of peaks and valleys. So the first two, you can perhaps justifiably say that they have a similar shape. It's just that the peaks and valleys don't match up. They in fact seem to cancel out. But the third one has an entirely different shape. So this notion is already entrenched in scientific literature, not just in mathematics or statistics. And I'm going to try and see if we could formalize this. What is the shape of a function? Well, you could, someone asks, what is the scale of the x-axis on this one? Is it on this plot? I think it goes for a few months. These are weekly readings. But you can find the paper online, it's freely available. So what I mean by a shape of a function. So if I start off with the function x, which is the black curve, if I translate it by a constant, real valued variable a, then all I'm doing is just shifting it up. But I preserve sort of the S-shaped or the inverted S shape of this function. The same thing happens when I scale it by a constant, the green curve. The S shape does not really change. In fact, the S shape doesn't change even when I do a fairly more complicated transformation of it. That is, I do some transformation to the x-axis, a monotone and smooth transformation, which preserves the ordering. All it means is I'm either dilating or contracting the x-axis in some way so that I'm making things go faster or slower. Okay, this also preserves the shape. It doesn't really change the shape S of this function. So we could think of a shape of a function as what is left behind of the black curve once I remove information pertaining to translations or scalings, or what we call as time warping or warping. Okay, so translation and scale can be dealt with fairly in a straightforward manner. So the focus of this talk will be on the third one, which is warping. So my definition of shape will be essentially the black curve up to warping variability. Okay, so this might be a fairly coarse definition of shape, but it does give us some useful properties. So this warping variation effectively gives us phase variation in a function. If I start off with the black curve on the left, the black function, and if I warp the x-axis using transformations of this sort, I end up with a bunch of curves on the right for each transformation I apply. It's quite evident that the function values does not really change at all. The entire sequence of y values for this function is observed here as well. They're preserved entirely, but only where they occur on the x-axis is changing. And it's changing not arbitrarily, but in an order preserving way. You will either move everything to the right or everything to the left or in some way. So effectively, you're not really changing the shape of the function. So formally, a shape of a function, we can define it to be an equivalence class. So I start off with some function space consisting of real valued functions on the unit interval. So I have the space X of real valued functions. It can't be just all real valued functions. We'll have to reduce the space, but we'll come to that later. And then I consider this set gamma of warping functions, which are basically increasing functions, strictly increasing functions, which preserve the endpoints. This forms a group, an algebraic group, under the action of composition. Okay, so this is a group, this is a set, so I have this group acting on a set. And hence, I can define equivalence classes. That is, two elements of an equivalence class are related by the group action. Or in other words, I will define the shape of a function x to be the set of all other functions which are related to x just through a warping of its x-axis. Okay, so this is the orbit or the shape of an x. It's of a function x, and it is an equivalence class. Okay, so pictorially, we could think of something like this. So I have this function x, x1 here. Its orbit as a cartoon, you can think of all other functions I could get by taking x1 and then warping it with all the gammas which are in this other function space. The easiest way to think of these gamma, at least from a statistics perspective, is you can think of these as CDFs of random variables taking values on 0, 1. So these are continuous CDFs, so strictly increasing, and for random variables taking values in 0 and 1. So I can think of the orbit of x1 as basically fixing x1 and then applying all the warpings to it to get something like this above. So that would be the shape of x1, the set of all functions which are related in this manner. Similarly for x2 and the others. Okay, this is nice, but in order to make any further progress, we would have to give some coordinates to the space. So the set of each of these orbits or the shapes forms the quotient or the shape space. Now I need to give some coordinates to the space. Only then can I relate one point to another point in a certain way. At the level of equivalence classes, it's too abstract to do anything further with it. So we need to develop some coordinates. Let's first see how this is done in the multivariate setting. Not necessarily in the shape setting, but just in multivariate statistics. That is, I have a set X of k by k positive definite matrices with eigenvalues which are all distinct. Okay, and then I can think of the orthogonal group of matrices acting on it in this particular fashion. So I have a group, I have it acting on a space X, and then each orbit of a matrix X basically corresponds to a spectral decomposition of the matrix X. So a set of coordinates for this equivalence class are the set of all other matrices which are related to X through this particular transformation can be given once we notice that every single matrix in this set has exactly the same set of eigenvalues because of the assumptions we've made. So these eigenvalues are invariants. Not only are they invariants, they in fact uniquely index these orbits. So every element in this orbit will have the same set of eigenvalues. Okay. So now basically I have two options to give it coordinates. First option is I can just take these eigenvalues, this k of them, and then I can take a k-dimensional vector which gives me coordinates for each orbit. This set is one-to-one with the orbits because of the uniqueness of the spectral decomposition. It's unique because first I've assumed that the eigenvalues are all distinct and positive. And then I've also ordered them, so I've gotten rid of the permutations. So I make the spectral decomposition unique. So this is one-to-one with the orbits. So I can either choose this as coordinates. The other option is to take each of these eigenvalues and put it into a diagonal matrix. Now such a matrix will also be positive definite, and hence the set of all such diagonal matrices with eigenvalues in them will be a subset of the original set X. Now it's a subset, not any arbitrary subset, but it's a subset which cuts across every orbit exactly at a single point. So if you think of the space X, and then you have all these orbits which are decomposing X, the set S will be cutting across every orbit at exactly a single point. So I could either give coordinates to the orbits in terms of elements of S, or I could use the vector of eigenvalues. Okay. They are intuitively quite the same, but mathematically they turn out to lead to different properties. Okay. With the first one, what I have is I have a one-to-one mapping between the space of PD matrices to a product space containing these eigenvalues times the orthogonal matrix. That means every matrix, every PD matrix can be uniquely decomposed into a vector of eigenvalues and a single orthogonal matrix. On the other hand, here, since I've identified S with a subset of X, I in fact have a decomposition of the space as a product space. So what it gives us is I start off with my space X, and then I end up with shape coordinates. Gamma is the nuisance. I can sort of ignore it if I can do this kind of a decomposition. Okay, so that is the main idea here. And we would like to do something like this for functions as well. We're talking about shapes of functions. So the natural question to wonder is, well, what happens when we look at shapes in finite dimensions? So the next example is if we were to look at shape and size coordinates of n points in Rk. So I put them together into a matrix n by k. I have n points in Rk, and then I'm interested in defining their shape and size. So this notion of shape and size should be invariant to any kind of orthogonal transformations of the endpoints, or maybe even rotations of endpoints. But I'm only going to look at orthogonal transformations here, which means I will allow for the configuration to be reflected. But that's a minor issue. It's not the main point here. So each orbit now contains the set of all other matrices, which are orthogonal transformations of the k-dimensional rows which are in the configuration matrix X. Okay. So this is the set of all possible matrices in some sense which have the same size and shape as X. In a similar way to what we did before, as a special case, instead of the spectral decomposition or the SPD, we look at the QR decomposition here because I don't have a square matrix. So I break it up into a lower triangular matrix and an orthogonal matrix, and I will make it unique by imposing conditions on the lower triangular one. And so the elements of the lower triangular matrix becomes the invariants. So the corresponding space Y will be, I could think of it as a vector containing all the elements of the lower triangular matrix. Or I can take the matrix itself, the lower triangular matrix, and note that it is a subset of X, and then this S will form a global cross section, just like a global cross section in this set. So either way, I end up in some sense decomposing the space, what I started off with, into shape space times nuisance space. And that helps me coordinatize the shape space. Okay. Hopefully this is clear. At this point, are there any questions before I continue further? Okay. Now let's go back to functions and then see whether we can replay the same formula in some sense. Here we're looking at orthogonal transformations. So they are isometric, they preserve the length and so on. So we look at finding invariants through isometric actions, even for the functions. So if I have a function and I have the corresponding warped version of the function with the gamma, we've noticed that when I compose X with gamma, the image is entirely preserved. The values do not change. So essentially, what is unique to an entire orbit of X are only the ordered set of extrema, that is the local minima and the maxima, and the values at time 0 and time 1. Because anything in between is basically unique only up to a certain warping. Any segment between successive minima maxima is basically monotone. Since it is monotone and my warping is another monotone function, I can basically cover all monotone segments through warpings. So the only thing which is remaining effectively are the ordered sequence of extrema and the beginning and the end points. So this is under value preserving action, that is composition. So I can also view this as being an isometric action, because if I apply the uniform norm on X, that is the supremum norm, then the supremum norm is preserved when I take a warping as well. So I have an isometric action of the group here as well. If I don't wish to work with X, but I work with its derivative, then there's an appropriate change of action. Instead of preserving values, I preserve areas between the zero crossings. So what I end up preserving are the shaded yellow regions between the zero crossings. So here I have a vector of extrema, which are preserved, and the beginning and the end points. Here I have a vector of areas between the zero crossings. This will be one pure dimension. This is L1 preserving. So this preserves the L1 norm. So it's an isometric action with respect to the L1 norm. Or I can go to L2 by taking square root and retaining the sign of the derivative. Then I just preserve sort of square root of the signed areas between the zero crossings. Nothing to stop me here. I can go to LP. I can extend this argument. In some sense, as P goes to infinity, I go back to value preserving. Okay. I collapse all these areas up to a single point. So I can find invariants just like the way we did in multivariate statistics through the action of the warping, and hence try and develop some notions of invariance and offer coordinates to the shape space. But in order to do this, I need to start off with a nice function space X. If the story is going to be about extrema, local minima and maxima, then I can't have functions which have flats, because they will destroy the notion of whatever I need for shape. So effectively, I'm going to take functions wherein every critical point is non-degenerate. That is, its second derivative of at the critical point will not be equal to 0. These are effectively called MOHS functions on 0, 1. MOHS functions are usually defined on manifolds in order to find the topology of the manifold. Here, the manifold is basically 0, 1 with a boundary at 0 and 1. Okay, but that effectively these are twice differentiable functions in some sense with some constraints. Since the endpoints at 0 and 1 are preserved, the values of the function, I will just call them extrema, though even they might not be extrema, because they are preserved and I'll need it in order to define the invariance. Now, these MOHS functions are nice because, one, they are effectively polynomials. They are just like polynomials. If I take any polynomial x and I perturb it linearly, it is a MOHS function. So there is very little difference between a MOHS function and a nice polynomial. And we all understand polynomials. We know how shapes of polynomials look based on their degrees, which parts of the domain they go up, they come down. So this is a nice set of functions to look at. But we will see that this set, even though nice, is not large enough, and that contributes to, in some sense, nasty behavior in the geometry. The other advantage is, of course, on a compact domain like 0, 1, I can only have a finite number of extrema. So it's for every function, I can only extract a finite number of extrema. So there's automatic dimension reduction in some sense on the shape space, or by going to the shape space. So the first result is shape coordinates for function with k extrema. One of the things which will become clear is I cannot just look at all functions at the same time. I need to break them up depending on how many extrema they have. And it will become clear immediately as to why that is so. So I'll start off with functions with k extrema, some finite integer. And the set of all extrema, that is just the values of the y-axis which correspond to the critical values of the function, These can be described by just taking differences and noting that successive differences, the product of them should be negative. This is in bijection with the shape space. Okay. This intuitively we've already understood. This is just formalizing it. But the second result says, okay, this is one way of giving coordinates to the shape space, that is using the set yk. The other way, if you remember from the multivariate setting, was to identify a subset of x itself, which cuts across each orbit at one point. That amounts to saying from each orbit, I need to be able to extract a function which has the same extrema. So it's possible to show that you can find a k+1 degree polynomial which has exactly the same extrema as x. So the orbit of x is completely indexed by the extrema. And so from each orbit of any x, from an orbit of any x, I can construct a unique polynomial which has this extrema. Okay, and which will also be a Morse function. So I have to basically break up this subset S, which is the global cross section, into many pieces. When I put them all together, I get the cross section. The same happens even to the vector of extrema. So I have this kind of a one-to-one correspondence between the original function space and shape coordinates given in terms of the extrema vector, and then shape coordinates given in terms of the polynomials. The difference here is, of course, that the extrema vector is in k dimensions. The polynomial is a k+1 degree polynomial. So if we identify polynomials through their coefficients, we have k+1 dimensions. Okay, and you'll see the repercussions of this. So this existence result actually goes back to 1956 to Chandler Davis, who talks about extrema of polynomials and whether they can be mapped uniquely to certain whether they can characterize polynomials in a certain sense. So a straightforward adaptation of his result leads us to what we want in this setting. Right. So we've given coordinates to this shape space. One is with the extrema, the other one is with the polynomials. The extrema vector is fairly easy to see, just a bunch of y's, and you just need to rearrange them so that they preserve up and down order. On the other hand, the geometry of these polynomials are slightly more complicated. But what we have is these are polynomials which are Morse functions. So Morse functions means non-degenerate second derivatives at the critical points. Effectively, that means that I cannot have a polynomial with basically multiplicity of a root which is bigger than 2. If it is bigger than 2, then it will fail to be Morse. So I have results from algebraic geometry which describe the geometry of polynomials, of real polynomials. And we could adapt such results basically to see how the geometry of the shape space calligraphic SK is, that is K extrema. Okay, so the result here says it's a stratified manifold. That is, it is taken up and broken into individual little pieces. Okay, and each piece basically is a submanifold in Rk+1. But the dimension of each piece or each stratum depends on whether 0 and 1 are roots and their corresponding multiplicities. Okay, if neither 0 nor 1 is a root, then that little piece is of dimension k+1. If one of them has root 2, has multiplicity 2, and the other one 0 or 1, 1, so on, then it's of 2 fewer dimensions, sorry. Otherwise, it's of dimension k. Okay, so this is a geometry which comes about by looking at multiplicity of roots of the polynomial we have extracted from each orbit. It's not really looking at the geometry of the coefficients of the polynomials which give coordinates to the polynomials. That is ideally what one would like to do. But this, on the other hand, is giving a geometry based on multiplicity of the roots. So that is the geometric description. What is the topological description? Well, topology is only up to diffeomorphisms, that is those which don't really up to one-to-one smooth mappings. So I can basically take my vector of extrema. Remember, my vector of extrema basically goes up and down and up and down, or down and up and down and up. So I can just take this and map it to alternating permutations of 1 to k. That is, I can take each of these real numbers and then just map it to an integer through a diffeomorphism in such a way so that those integers will be going up and down as alternating permutations of 1 to k. Hence, the topology of those two sets will effectively be the same. So for example, the permutation 1, 3, 2, 4 of 1 to 4 is an alternating permutation because 3 is larger than 1 and 3 is also larger than 2. So it's like a peak and then it comes down. Okay. On the other hand, 1, 2, 4, 3 is not. So topologically, this set Sk, or the extrema, through its connection to that extrema vector, is equivalent to alternating permutations of 1 to 2. Okay, so this gives a description of the shape space in the given coordinates using the polynomials. So let's just, I can quickly visualize this. It's not in higher dimensions, it's not very helpful. So if I look at the set of second degree polynomials, which are Morse functions. Okay. So the second degree polynomials, I'll basically have one critical point based on whether I have roots at 0 or 1. The space of interest on the plane is this dark gray region. That is the set which corresponds to Morse polynomials we are interested in. This set is stratified. It has many, many pieces. Each piece is a submanifold according to the result. I have drawn 3 strata here, or 3 pieces. So the red line which cuts across says that it is a piece which corresponds to the situation or corresponds to polynomials having one root at 1. And blue corresponds to those polynomials which have 1 or 2 roots at 0. And their intersection is the green point. Right? So these are, I plotted 3 strata, the green, the red, and the blue, within this dark gray region, which is the set of interest, which contains all the Morse polynomials I need. How is this dark gray region determined? Well, it's just by starting off with a polynomial and then verifying that the Morse conditions are valid. That is, I take derivatives, I force the roots to lie between 0, 1, and then make sure that whatever the condition inequality which arises from ensuring that the critical points are non-degenerate. On the right-hand side, it's a little harder to explain, so I won't try. These are for cubics. What is effectively happening here is this bottom plane in light blue is shaped in this, where this little arc is cut off, this sector that corresponds actually to the 2 dimension we see here. And when gamma, that is the intercept, is equal to 0, I get the gray region, this gray object here. And when gamma is equal to 1, then I just translate the object above. So effectively for all gammas, I have a surface which goes above like this. And my space of interest is the intersection of that surface with this blue region and the red line which is cutting across. Okay, so it's not a very nice region as such. It's fairly well, unintuitive. But the key thing to note here is this is containing one extremum. These are 2 extrema, interior in some sense. These are the Morse functions here, Morse functions here. What is in between them? The boundary for these 2. Well, the boundary will contain all functions which are just about Morse but not Morse. So which means they'll contain functions which have inflection points, or they will contain functions with roots which have multiplicity which are larger than 2. All of them will belong to the boundary of these 2. But that boundary is fairly fat in some sense. There are too many functions there. So by restricting to Morse functions, we really make the geometry quite complicated. So it's not really satisfactory from that perspective in terms of prescribing a geometry to the shape space by using the multiplicities. But I think it's a useful start. It gives us some ideas as to how we can use results from algebraic geometry. Right, so that concludes the first part. I'll quickly run through the second part unless anyone has a question. Okay. Well, we've looked at the geometrical aspects. Now we want to talk about distributions. We basically have a few options. The first option is not really useful in practice. I start off with a distribution or a measure on the function space, and then I push it down under the map, which takes the function to its coordinates, either the polynomial or to the extrema. And since this is broken up into many pieces, I would get a mixture distribution. So for example, if I start with the Gaussian process or a Gaussian measure on the top space, which with a covariance which satisfies these conditions, then every random function from this is effectively MOHS. And when I push it down, I get pieces which actually have densities. The push forward actually has density within each of these pieces. So it's well behaved. But this is not very useful in practice. What is more useful is if I can just have a generative model, or if I can just sample directly from it. For that, I just look at the extrema, which is a k-dimensional vector which satisfies these constraints. So I just sample any k-dimensional vector and basically rearrange them to satisfy this. That can be done for any vector in Rk. And I can just interpolate them to get a random function. So this is the most friendly option. The third option is to start off with a measure on the top space, X, use the decomposition, either with Sk, as I've written here, with this cross section, or with the extrema, and then try and integrate out the nuisance. But one problem is the nuisance or the group is infinite dimensional, so it doesn't have any uniform distribution on it. So we would have to integrate it out with respect to something which is not uniform. And well, there's nothing wrong necessarily with it, but in some sense you would be weighting certain group elements more than the others, and that might lead to complications down the line. So we can have three basic options in some sense of defining statistical models on the shape space. Options 1 and 3 start off from a distribution or a model on the top space and then induce one onto the shape. Option 2 just works directly with the shape space, meaning it just looks at finite dimensional distributions for each piece and then works directly with it. How is looking at shape useful in functional data? Well, this is really what we're eventually interested in for data analysis. So the first thing is, if you identify exactly what are the coordinates of a shape space, or what are the coordinates you can equip a shape space with, then in some sense, you don't really care about where the peaks and the valleys of the functions occurred. You only extract their extrema. So there's no need to align peaks and valleys of the functions which you observed as data before doing any registration, before doing any analysis. So here's a simulated example where on the left, all the orange curves are raw functions, and the black one is a pointwise mean. Okay. And the next three arise from applying a registration procedure on these functions using 3 different registration methods. Okay. And then taking the corresponding pointwise mean once I've aligned and registered all the peaks and the valleys. So you can see that the results are quite different depending on which registration procedure one uses. So in some sense, this is, well, it's almost like a modeling choice. Choosing a registration method amounts to, in some sense, picking a certain model. So there is no one correct one over the other as such. There are only ones which are better than the other. But if you're interested purely in the shape of a function, then this is an arbitrary choice, and you might wish to avoid it. So it avoids registration. That is one useful thing. The second thing is it can be quite useful for clustering and classification. I'll show an example soon. And the third one, which is of more theoretical interest, is because of the finite dimensionality of the shape space in terms of those strata and those pieces, these notions of identifiability of mean plus error models are easily available. So here's a quick example where classification can be done quite easily without doing any registration. So this is a data set corresponding to nitrous oxide levels in Barcelona for non-working days and working days, okay, in 2005. Non-working days and working days, you would expect to see some phase variation because of differences in peak timings for the two classes. So if you want to distinguish between the two classes using some kind of a classifier, you would first need to align the peaks and the valleys in some sense before coming up with any classifier, because the phase variability is nuisance. Okay, that's an artificial thing. So But without doing any registration, if you just extract, if you smooth this perhaps, and then extract the vector of extrema for each one of them, here you can see that their distributions for the working and the non-working days are quite different. In fact, it's enough to not take all of them. It's enough to take just the minimum and the maximum for each one of them, and just running a simple logistic regression with those as the predictors gives you very good accuracy. So this is almost a toy illustration of how you can just do some decent classification without doing any registration at all for functional data. The final example, which I think is of more current interest, is clustering US states with COVID-19 data using shape. I will look at two approaches. I haven't implemented either of these approaches. I've just, without any compunction, stolen it because I know the authors of both the papers. So the first one looks at clustering US states for data roughly between February and October. There's some differences between the two data sets, but they're roughly the same. First one just looks at clustering based on a distance between shapes of functions. And the second one actually models it explicitly using a probability model, having a joint Bayesian model for registration and clustering. Right? Both of these are really interesting works for this particular talk, mainly because they both use this norm-preserving action, or the L2 action, which preserves the square root of the areas between the zero crossings, and the square root velocity framework, which is a popular framework for doing functional data analysis. Both of them use this framework. The first one just works in distances on a shape distance. The second one actually explicitly models the warping and the variabilities. But both of them give us clustering. Okay, so there are two different approaches, but both based on using shapes explicitly to do the clustering. So the results on the left correspond to the method using distances. Okay, and on the right comes from the results pertain to one from the Bayesian model. Now, of course, the colors are different and so on. But if you just see the pattern of colors on the left-hand side and then on the right-hand side, yes, quite strikingly similar in certain regions. So for instance, if we look at the cluster containing 0 extrema on the right-hand side, and then we look at cluster 1, which is purple on the left-hand side, these pertain to functions which are effectively strictly increasing with 0 extrema, meaning 0 interior extrema. The only things which are actually relevant are the beginning and the end points. Okay, so those two clusters almost exactly match up. There are 5 clusters here on the right, and there are 4 clusters here. But in fact, there are only 4 clusters here because these 2 clusters are clusters which have the same shape, but they only differ in shape, in phase, early peak and late peak. So effectively, you have only 4 shape clusters on the right-hand side, and you have 4 here as well. So they're quite strikingly similar, maybe because they're using the same norm-preserving action and their square root velocity framework. But this one actually, the one on the right actually models everything. The one on the left just uses the distance. But this tells you that it's quite useful to consider shape for functional data as such. So hopefully this is a half convincing at least example saying, well, despite all the difficulties which are there with the geometry of the space and so on, in practice, you could still do something useful with it. But I do wish to emphasize that both these approaches, you had to do some registration. It wasn't avoided like I gave an example in the previous case, because in order to actually find distances between shapes, you have to do some registration in order to define a valid distance. So that is not something which you can avoid in these two cases. So finally, I just want to summarize by saying there are some issues with just looking at shapes of functions for modeling purposes, and especially looking at it through this particular perspective of the polynomials and so on. Having a good model and having a good understanding of the geometry of the shape space are in some sense intertwined with one another quite heavily. So having a good understanding of the geometry will be useful, and perhaps the geometry prescribed through the multiplicity of the roots is not the best way to go forward, but it gives us a good starting point. And it points us towards looking at more results in algebraic geometry in terms of geometry of polynomials, whether that could be exploited to our advantage. The use of shape polynomials for serious data analysis, as I said, it requires a metric because you need to compare polynomials, you need to find averages, you need to do those things. So without any alignment, I would need to be able to define a metric directly on these polynomials, which in some sense preserves the shape information, but without which I have to do some form of registration. The other thing is, technically, when we say functional data, we don't really observe full functions. Data is discrete. So given data, in order to view it as functional data and do all these things, unless you have very good understanding of the data generating mechanism, some sort of smoothing is required. You need to do some sort of interpolation or dimension reduction or something. And what you do, how you smooth, will affect the vector, how you extract the extrema, as you can quite easily imagine, and hence the polynomial. So in practice, the definition of shape needs some careful thought, especially when there's a lot of noise in the observed functions. Stop. Thank you very much.